Welcome.
Thank you all very much. I have the pleasure of actually working with Steph on Web Standards Sherpa as well, which is a great and fun project from the Web Standards project. But today I'm going to be talking to you mainly about progressive enhancement and talking about how we can create really cool experiences using the various techniques and technologies that we have available to us. So the first thing that always comes up is, what exactly is progressive enhancement? How many people here have used the term progressive enhancement? How many people here feel like they have a strong understanding of what it is? How many people think it's the same thing as graceful degradation? All right, we're gonna talk about how those two terms are related, and we'll talk a little bit about responsive stuff as well. But the way I like to think about progressive enhancement is this Mitch Hedberg quote got surfaced, I think, by Scott Gell first. But he likes an escalator because an escalator can never break. It can only become stairs, right? Staircase. Similarly, an electric toothbrush can't break. If it stops working, it's simply a toothbrush, right? That's how we should be building websites. A dynamic web page can never break. It can only become a web page. Wait, if JavaScript doesn't load, shit. This is embarrassing. This is a little bit better than what they used to have. Initially, when Lifehacker, when the entire Gawker Media platform relaunched, they used JavaScript to do everything, to load in all the content of the pages. And when they first loaded up, or when they first launched, there was an error in the JavaScript, which caused script execution to stop, and this was all you got. And I love that there's this little loading icon that actually spun in the corner, but it never actually loaded anything, because they had hard-coded that graphic in there, but it didn't actually do anything. So it's a little bit better, but still not a whole lot better. So one of the stories that I like to use for kind of talking about what our job is like is, I think that our job is very much like someone who busses tables. So this is something that probably happens a little bit more in the States, where we have actual water service as opposed to bottled water service. But I go back to this time when I was in Seattle with my wife, and we went out to dinner 2 different nights to 2 very, very nice restaurants, and we had great experiences at both of them, but one was just a little bit better. And I realized that the reason that experience was better was because the water service was amazing. I literally would put my glass down, and I would look back at it, and it would be filled again. And that's pretty good, that you can like sneak up to the table, refill somebody's water, and then get away without anybody seeing. And that's how we should try and be on the web, because as with somebody who is doing a water service at a restaurant, they have no idea when you walk in the door how much water you're going to want, how thirsty you are, how much you're going to consume. Similarly, we have no clue who a user is, what their circumstances are, what device they're on, what sort of context they're in. We don't know anything about our users. So we need to be able to create an experience that's going to work for them regardless of whether they are a great consumer of water or a low consumer of water. We don't want to be, throwing water in their face. But that's what this is, right? If you come to this site and you don't have JavaScript enabled for one reason or another, let's say you're on a feature phone, and in order to more quickly access the web, you've turned off JavaScript and CSS. If this is all you're getting, that's kind of shit, isn't it? It's awful. It's not a good experience. It's not what we should be striving to do. So progressive enhancement is about creating great experiences without any sort of technological restrictions. And it seems like it should be some really difficult, complicated thing. This is, how to use a zero-gravity toilet. But it's actually quite easy, especially in the areas of CSS and HTML. And I'll kind of get to the reason for that in a moment, but I want to start with a story. So back in 1977, a little company was formed called Apple, and they came out with the Apple IIe. There was some great music that came out in that year. I was born in that year, so it was automatically awesome. For those of you who've watched Happy Days, this was literally the year that the Fonz jumped the shark, if you've heard that phrase. It comes from Happy Days. He literally did jump a shark on water skis in the leather jacket. But on this little tiny archipelago off the coast of South America, the Galapagos Islands, something really awesome was happening. Something really sad, but awesome. There was a horrible drought. And during this horrible drought, the trees and the various plants that were on the island either stopped producing seeds, or the ones that had really hard seeds were the only ones that actually produced any seeds. So the Galapagos finches, which any of you who've studied Darwin are probably familiar with, live on the island and consume these seeds. But what happened was, because the plants stopped producing the smaller, easier to eat seeds, about half the population of finches died off, the ones with the smaller beaks, because they were no longer able to consume the seeds. They couldn't break the shells. And this is obviously kind of crazy. But what happened was instantaneous evolution. Essentially, the next generation of finches had, by and large, larger beaks. So they were able to adapt better. But what's particularly interesting is that under normal circumstances, if there had not been a drought that year, the birds with the larger beaks would not have possessed any significant advantage over the birds with smaller beaks. But when this massive shift change happened at the environmental level, the birds with the larger beaks were well positioned to take advantage of that and to excel and continue to pass on their genes. So HTML and CSS are kind of meant to be the perfect bird. They're meant to be totally adaptable. And what you write now will work next year, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, because of this one little thing called fault tolerance. So fault tolerance, as you can see here, is a system's ability to continue to operate when it encounters an unexpected error. So in terms of the Galapagos Islands, it was able to deal with fault tolerance by having variance in the ecosystem in terms of the beak sizes. So the finch populations were able to continue to survive. We didn't have a complete die-off of finches because there was fault tolerance built into the ecosystem. We see this at the organism level, where lizards can regrow their tails, starfish can regrow a large portion of their body. And we also see this at the organ level, where a brain can remap itself when it suffers a trauma. And we've seen this at work in nature and have taken to using it in our own creations as well, such as the smart grid, cellular networks. One tower can lose connection to the mobile device, and another one can pick it up, those sorts of things. And how fault tolerance works for us as web designers is that browsers are instructed to ignore anything that they don't understand. And we can use this to our advantage. But before I get into techniques of how to do that, I want to talk a little bit about how progressive enhancement and graceful degradation are related. So for nearly a decade after the creation of the web, originally, the medium was rapidly evolving. We first got images added, which images were originally kind of an afterthought for the web. But shortly after images, we started getting audio, video, lots of fun Java applets and things like that. And it was a challenge to keep up. We got very caught up in what was going on the web and all these neat new technologies. And a lot of the stuff that we created was not terribly usable, and certainly not accessible. And we kind of termed this idea graceful degradation of creating sites that worked in modern browsers, but maybe treated older browsers as kind of not so great. We knew we were going to have a worse experience in those browsers. And in some cases, we actually blocked older browsers altogether. How many people here have gone to a site and have been told that they still need IE6 in order to run it? I've gone to a couple, like I'll be in Firefox or something, like you have to have IE6 to run this. I still hit that, especially on banking sites. I'm not quite sure why. But so people, smart people, especially Steve Champion, who is still at the Web Standards Project, but was at the Web Standards Project at the time, realized that this was a problem. This was not a good approach to give short shrift, basically, to older browsers. So he coined this new term, progressive enhancement. And the idea behind progressive enhancement is that you started from the content of your site and then built upon that layer by layer, kind of expanding out. Another metaphor I like to use for progressive enhancement is kind of like a peanut M&M. You start with this nugget of content, which is the peanut, and then we can wrap around that some delicious chocolate. Maybe that's our rich design layer. And then the JavaScript is the bit that makes it not melt in your hand, right? And each of these are, in this case, we've got peanut in the US, this is a goober, and then peanut M&M. Each of these is a completely reasonable snack, and all of them are tasty and all of them are satisfying. But they're kind of different steps of experience, different levels of experience for the taster. So in the same way, Progressive Enhancement is providing different levels of experience for our users in terms of coming to our websites. And a lot of this is in service of accessibility, which most of us kind of think of in terms of special needs. But what we're starting to see more and more is that special needs are really contextual. People who are on mobile devices have special needs. People who are just on small screens or who are surfing on a television or devices that we haven't even imagined yet. People who are surfing the web on their refrigerators, if LG gets their way. But these special needs are more than just the special needs of red-green color blindness or blue-yellow color blindness. They have more to do than that. And we don't want to end up in a situation where we're essentially telling somebody you must be this high to ride. You know, we don't want to force our users to have to upgrade because they may not be able to upgrade for one reason or another. You know, they may have spent all that they could on a particular Android device that's not quite as great a browser as an iPhone, and we have an iPhone, so that's what we think we need to design for. And similarly, there are people who are still stuck in IE6 who have no ability to upgrade because it's their corporate standard. And their corporation won't let them upgrade or install Chrome Frame. The relationship between progressive enhancement and this old idea of graceful degradation is basically that all progressive enhancement is graceful degradation, in that progressive enhancements degrade gracefully. So what works in a modern browser is still going to work pretty well on an older browser. It won't be maybe as feature-rich, but it'll still be good. On the contrary, not all graceful degradation is progressive enhancement, so kind of helps to understand that a little bit. So after Steve coined the term progressive enhancement, and we all started kind of thinking this was a great way to go, and started building JavaScript using techniques like hijacks, which Jerry McKeith coined that term, basically taking a normal form and then hijacking it to use Ajax and such. Then along came the Apple HTML5 showcase, and when we wiped the drool off of our desks, people were like, oh, progressive enhancement sucks. Progressive enhancement's awful, it's holding us back, I can't do all the neat things that I want to do, so screw it. I'm not going to bother with progressive enhancement anymore. But what they failed to realize is that progressive enhancement isn't about browsers. Okay, browsers and technologies and all of these things, they come and go. But the content is what's important. Content is why we build websites. And we want to ensure that users have access to our content and that users can interact with our content, perhaps create content using our tools. And we don't want to restrict them, restrict their ability to do that simply because of their particular browsing condition, shall we say. So we don't want to lose sight of our users. So to do one final graceful degradation versus progressive enhancement comparison here, graceful degradation basically assumed that the older the browser was, older being on the right-hand side here, the worse the user experience was going to be, and that was a given. Progressive enhancement, on the other hand, says, okay, let's look at the browser and device capabilities, and we'll provide a baseline experience, and then improve the user experience over time based on how advanced the capabilities of that given browser are. And a lot of this has to do with feature detection and stuff like that, but we'll also talk about some techniques in JavaScript and CSS as to how we can go about doing this. So we start with our baseline content layer and then apply perhaps some semantics on top of that to enrich that content, to make it more useful to users. And then on top of that, we can apply some level of design to it, and then interactivity. And then perhaps, although accessibility should really be kind of throughout your process, we have specific enhancements we can do in ARIA that allow us to create even richer experiences for users who are using assistive technology like screen readers. So in terms of mapping these to technologies, Text in HTTP is really the baseline experience for everybody, even the Lynx browser, which how many people here have used Lynx? All right, quite a few of you. Lynx is a kind of a fun tool for seeing how good your site is and how accessible your site is. And then we've, of course, got HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and then ARIA. But this isn't just each of these isn't just kind of a single layer. Each one of them is kind of subdivided. So in the case of HTML, some browsers may have HTML4 support. Some may have HTML4 and microformats. Some may have HTML4 microformats and HTML5 support. So there's also different levels kind of support within each of these kind of broader categories. So let's walk through a couple of examples here. We'll start with progressive enhancement in HTML. So in HTML5, we have the video element. And one of the neat things about how fault tolerance works within the browsers is that they ignore what they don't understand. So any browser that understands HTML5 will see the video element and its source options, and they'll pick their source based on which one they understand. But browsers that don't understand video can actually just get the fallback, which you include within the video. In most cases, what I like to do with video and audio tags is include a list and perhaps a poster of the video, but a list to download any of the formats that I've already created. So if somebody does not have native video support, they just get this list. I don't bother with a flash fallback in most cases because they can just download it and watch it on their own machine. The files are out there anyway. I don't really care about protecting them. Oops, missing a dot. So provided a perfect fallback for the users. Similarly, when we want to use the new form controls that we have within HTML5, which Christian talked a little bit about, we can use things like type equals date. And browsers that get it will create things like a spinner control. I think that's the Safari one. And then Opera creates actually a drop-down date picker. And then browsers that do not understand HTML5 date fields will just get a simple text area, which we could do some JavaScript sniffing to determine whether or not date is supported. And if it is not supported, we could create a JavaScript-based date picker that basically supercharges this field and makes it into an almost native version of the date field. And then for browsers that don't have JavaScript support, we still end up with a baseline input, which is pretty cool. And as long as we're doing our server-side validation, which we should be anyway, regardless of whether you're using HTML5 on the front end, because you can never trust the client, we're still creating a great experience, and we're able to provide feedback for users to make sure that they have access to putting in an appropriate date and aren't giving us junk information. On the CSS end of things, this is what enables us to do things like RGBA color with fallbacks for older browsers that don't understand RGBA. So RGBA is RGB color channels with an alpha channel as well. And what happens is a browser that doesn't understand RGBA comes along and it says, OK, I understand the paragraph selector, so I'll read this rule set. The first rule is color of a light gray. All right, I understand that. Color RGBA, oh, what's RGBA? I don't understand that. So it'll ignore that, and it'll just apply the light gray. But a browser that comes along and understands RGBA will see this first color value and apply that, and then it'll move on and it'll see color RGBA, and it's black at 50%. So it will apply that and override the previous value. So this is how this works. We can get even more complex with it when we have a selector that older browsers don't understand. So this particular selector would not be understood by IE6, for instance. So this selects any paragraph that is a descendant of HTML with a lang attribute. So IE6 would not get this rule. IE7 would, however, and IE7 would get the color of light gray, but it wouldn't get the RGBA value because it doesn't understand RGBA. So these are ways that we can start to layer our CSS and enhance it for browsers that do have a better understanding of certain techniques and technologies that are available to us, but not leave older browsers behind. Sure, they may not get the best experience, but they'll get an experience that's positive. So this was probably best put to use by Igor Klus. This was back in, I think, 2003-ish. And he built this gemination for the CSS Zen Garden. And for IE6 and under, they got this kind of boxy version, but every other browser got this kind of high-res cool one, which had sliding panels and all that sort of stuff. And Dave Shea, who is the curator of the Zen Garden, dubbed that Mosey Enhancements because it was for Mozilla Opera Safari. Of course, then IE7 came along and kind of shat all over that because it was able to render this. So Mosey, that term fell out of favor. But what he was doing here was that he had his basic layout of hash intro in this case, applying specific basic layout stuff to something with an ID of intro. And then later on in his style sheet, he would say body with an ID of CSS Zen Garden, hash intro, and then he'd apply the advanced layout there. So it was a pretty cool thing. But one of the things that's interesting about this that kind of piqued my interest as I was reviewing this particular example again for the book was that in the second example, we're actually using a much more specific selector for hash intro, which could cause some specificity wars going on in our style sheets. So what I would actually suggest he do, if he were to go back and redo it now, is actually do a combined selector. Because if he were to say, in this case, something with an attribute that's foo, which doesn't exist on the page, comma, hash intro, what happens is due to the way that parsing errors are handled in browsers, if they don't understand any part of the selectors, in this case a compound selector, the entire rule set's ignored. So IE6 would come along and see this square bracket foo, and it would go ahead and ignore the whole thing, whereas IE7 would come along and say, okay, I know what an attribute selector is. This doesn't select anything, but I'll move on, and then I'll go to hash intro. So, and that doesn't affect the specificity of intro at all, which is kind of neat. So just a little trick. Not something you'd probably use all that often, but something to know about. Strangely, however, the whole compound selectors, that whole idea is not the same in terms of compound media selection. So if you were to do @media screen print refrigerator, IE has no idea what refrigerator media type is, but according to the rules of parsing errors in CSS, it's still supposed to treat that as though it understands it. So if it understands any of these, it will apply it in the particular context it's important to apply it in. So IE would get the rules inside of an @media block with screen print and refrigerator. Interestingly enough, though, IE7 and below would not understand an @import with a screen media type assigned to it. So that's another way to kind of filter out those browsers if you needed to. And we can create pretty complex rule sets. I hope you're never doing anything like this, but in this particular case, this is an @media set of media queries that's going for narrower desktops, so below 990 pixels, or iPhone running iOS 3, iPhone 4 in landscape view, or an iPad in portrait view, or rough equivalent, based on their dimensions. Please never do anything like this, but it illustrates how you can have really complex selectors or media selectors for rule sets, and use them to filter out what it is that you're delivering style rules to. And then finally, when we're starting to work with ARIA, we can begin applying roles such as banner, which is for banner information about the entire site that we're on, and roles of navigation, which in this case, you're seeing the role of navigation being used on an element that is nav, which seems redundant, right? Unfortunately, the way that ARIA came about and the way that HTML5 came about, they were both working to solve the same problems at about the same time in their own distinct silos. So there is some redundancy between what's happening in ARIA using the role attributes and what HTML5 sought to do with the introduction of elements like nav and header and footer, aside and the like. So the problem is that a lot of screen readers were working with the Web Accessibility Initiative at the W3C, and so they began incorporating the role recognition into screen reading software and aren't as aware of HTML5. So you could end up in a situation where the role would be understood, but the nav element would be ignored because the assistive technology doesn't know what to do with it. So And then when we begin using JavaScript in our documents, we can do interesting things like converting normal navigation into perhaps a drop-down list for a mobile device in order to take up less room. Or we can begin creating really cool experiences when you're dealing with dynamic stuff. So in this case, I'm taking the Twitter counter over here, the 140, which the baseline for this markup is actually an input that's disabled, which seems really pointless to me because it provides no context about what exactly the 140 is doing. The old markup that they used to have before they switched to the input was a little bit better. It was a span. Inside of it had a strong, so it was at least strongly emphasizing or saying that the 140 has strong importance. But it still provided no context. What is 140? If you've never used Twitter before, you have no idea what 140 means. So what my recommendation would be to do something like 140, and then inside of a B element with a class of hidden, characters remaining. So this way we're saying 140 characters remaining. That makes sense. That provides us with context about that number. And then using CSS, we can go ahead and hide that characters remaining, but it's still there. It's still available to assistive technology. Now that's before we apply any JavaScript to it. When we go and apply JavaScript to it, what we can do is we can start out with baseline markup that says maximum of 140 characters, which makes more sense if you don't have JavaScript enabled because it's not going to count down. So 140 characters remaining is always going to be 140 characters remaining. However, without JavaScript, you could say maximum of 140 characters. And then when you know your script can run, you can convert that over to 140 characters remaining. Because JavaScript is good at doing mundane stuff like that. And then using ARIA, we can use the live regions spec, which uses this ARIA live attribute to say politely interrupt the user as they're interacting with this interface. And then ARIA atomic tells it that I want to treat this entire span as an atomic unit, so it'll read out the entire contents as opposed to just what's changed, which is what ARIA live would do automatically. But what you end up with is this.
What's happening? Edit multi-line blank. T. Space. 125 characters remaining. Not 104 characters remaining.
So that's super helpful to somebody who's using a screen reader who is not able to actually see what's going on the screen. And we've provided a really cool interface for that user and probably made their day. And we can do the same thing, taking it even a step further with other sorts of interactive units. This is a slightly more complicated example, taking a simple pumpkin pie recipe. In this case, we've got overview, ingredients, directions, and then with a little bit of JavaScript wizardry, we can convert it into a tab interface, and then apply a few roles to it. In this case, we're telling that this is operating as an application. We can tell it which tab panel is currently available to it, and then we can go about saying, okay, here's a list of tabs, and we can associate them with the individual tab panels within the page. And then in the end,
Pumpkin Pie Mozilla Firefox. Application tab control. Overview tab selected 1 of 4. Ingredients tab selected 2 of 4. Directions tab selected 3 of 4. Directions heading level 2-1. Preheat oven to 425 degrees.
So this is a completely accessible tabbed interface, which we don't get all the time when we're creating neat interfaces like this. But with just a few simple roles and a little bit of JavaScript wizardry in terms of how we're handling moving through using the tab key, we can create a very rich experience for people who have assistive technologies. So you end up with very different levels of support, from the most basic, which would be this, to somebody who understands CSS and has JavaScript support, could be this, and then ARIA, you end up with this much richer experience that's actually able to tell you what's going on the page and how you're interacting with it. So in the end, if you take nothing else away from this, I'd like you to take away that we should really be building our websites, even our web applications in many cases. If you're building a Facebook clone or a Google Plus or something of that nature, there's no reason that you could not build it using straight up HTML and JavaScript and CSS and applying enhancements using ARIA to make a really rich application that's going to work for everybody, as opposed to something that's not. For instance, try using Google Plus without JavaScript turned on, or try sharing a link using Google Plus without JavaScript turned on. It won't work. And that seems to me at least, to be directly undermining your ability to get your content out there and to get your message out there. So applying technologies and layers, to me, is the way to go. If you're interested in reading more about this, you can pick up a copy of my book. You can go to easyreaders.net, or you can find Kelly, who's over there at the front table. We brought 20 copies with us because we had to carry them from the US, and we self-published it, so it's not going to be in your bookstores and stuff like that. But I talk a lot more about this stuff in there. Thank you very much. You can pick up my slides on SlideShare if you want them, and check out the Flickr photos too. Thanks.